Merci et bonjour tout le monde. Thank you very much for coming to this press conference, which is the culmination of a long process to get the Macdonald-Laurier Institute up and running here in Ottawa. I hope all of you have a copy of this little brochure, which explains the mission of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, some of the people who are involved, and some of the projects that we have forthcoming. Basically, as our name implies, we are a new, non-partisan, independent think tank. We hope to offer a unique platform in Ottawa for the best and brightest in Canada to examine public policy and suggest creative, cost-effective new policies. That's what we're doing today with our inaugural paper, and I'll turn to Calvin, Helin, and David Snow in a moment to talk about that paper. We are not going to duplicate the work of other think tanks which do such important work into provincial, regional, economic, and other issues. Our intention is to cover the entire federal waterfront, so to speak, from a national perspective. Today we're talking about Aboriginal policy. Later we'll be talking about national security, defense, healthcare, internal and foreign trade, communications, as well as, of course, things like taxes and budgets. This is one of our other forthcoming projects. It's called the Canadian Century, Moving Out of America's Shadow. And that will suggest that when Laurier predicted that the last century would be Canada's century, he was right on the money, but he was just off by 100 years. This may be the Canadian century, and today we are really beginning to move out of America's shadow. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today we're here to talk about this paper, Free to Learn, which has been co-authored by the two gentlemen on either side of me, Calvin Helin and Dave Snow. I'm going to ask Calvin to begin by talking a little bit about the reasons why it was important for us to do this paper. Calvin.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real privilege to be part of Macdonald-Laurier's inaugural session and day on the scene in Canada. It was my great pleasure to be part of this paper. The reason I am involved in the paper is because most people don't understand that the most important thing, in my opinion, to the continued prosperity and competitiveness of Canada is getting the Aboriginal population as constructive participants in the economy of the nation. For reasons of what I call a demographic tsunami, the Aboriginal population is the youngest and fastest growing population in Canada, and without going into a lot of detail, could be the most expensive social welfare cost to Canada in the future if we don't do something about proactive about the situation. And the most important thing we can do is invest in education. Aboriginal population is not doing too well, even though things have improved somewhat over the past few years in the area of education, but we could be doing a lot better. The problem with the current post-secondary education system is that the money isn't going to the students that it's supposed to be helping entirely. It's a very inefficient system, and it can be improved immeasurably. And so what we've proposed is and this is what David Snow will talk about in detail, is a way to address all of the concerns and to ensure that taxpayers' monies are spent in the way that has the greatest effect for the future of Canada. And from my point of view as an Aboriginal person, we represent the poorest population in Canada. This current system, Indian Act system, is beating up our people in a way that puts us in a category with people in terms of social pathologies and statistics of a third world nation. We have to do something about it. The most simple and direct thing we can do is to improve the current educational system, and so that's what this paper is intended to improve.
Thank you. Over to you, Dave, to describe a little bit what our proposal is.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, it's a like Calvin and Brian said, it's a pleasure to be here, and it was a real pleasure to be able to work on this project for what I think is one of the most important and pressing public policy issues facing both Aboriginal people and Canadians in general. Our project proposes to phase out over a 6 to 7 year period the post-secondary student support program, or PSSSP. As it's currently administered, the PSSSP consists of $314 million paid by Canadian taxpayers each year to Indian Northern Affairs Canada. This money is then distributed from Indian Northern Affairs Canada to individual First Nation bands and First Nations communities, who then give the money to their students. It's been well documented in various other studies that this program has led to, among other things, surplus funds being used for non-eligible expenses for staff and for members of chief and council. It's led to students being waitlisted and not receiving the money to which they're entitled for post-secondary education. It's led to substantial regional variation, where some regions of the country get much more money per student than others. It's led to widespread allegations of nepotism and favoritism with family members and people who are family members and friends receiving funding ahead of other students, and in particular, off-reserve First Nations students not being able to receive funding because of no relationship with family members. And finally, a complete lack of any form of performance measurement, in which there's no way to determine whether or not the PSSSP is actually achieving its obligations of getting more Aboriginal students into post-secondary education. So what we proposed in this paper, Free to Learn, is to phase out the PSSSP and replace it with what we call Aboriginal post-secondary savings accounts. These savings accounts would be set up at birth for every registered status Indian in Canada, and they would consist of $4,000 immediately at birth in these accounts. For the completion of every grade from grade 6 to 12 of what would be elementary, or excuse me, in some provinces elementary, but mostly middle school and junior high school and high school, the students would receive an additional $3,000 into this account, totaling, after graduation from high school, $25,000, without even taking into account the substantial interest that would accrue. This funding would then be available to the student for the use of any bona fide post-secondary educational institution, be it a college, a trade school, or university. What this would do was not only give the funding directly from Canadian taxpayers to the individual students themselves, empowering them to make their own decisions about where they go and for their own educational future, but also create a powerful incentive for these students to complete secondary school, what many scholars have called the low-hanging fruit, that then will enable them to pursue higher education and improve their own future. What we're proposing does not necessarily have to increase funding. It's merely showing a way of using the funds that are already being made available in a much more efficient, effective, and transparent manner. It's going to avoid the shortcomings of the PSSSP with respect to transparency and waste and corruption, and it would ensure fairness and consistency for all registered Indian students, regardless of whether or not they live on or off reserve. In closing, as we close in the paper, I'd like to point out that this is not just a good policy for Aboriginals, particularly for registered Indians, but this is a policy that's important and necessary for Canada as a whole. Calvin spoke briefly about the demographic crisis that's facing Canada due to an aging population, a low birth rate. Aboriginals, on average, are much younger and have a much higher birth rate than the rest of the country. And so not only empowering them to take control of their future and receive the skills necessary to succeed in the modern workforce, that's imperative. It's also imperative for Canadians that we make use of all of our population and ensure that everyone has the best way of life going forward. Thank you.